You're very welcome to the Irish Political Roundup with me, Paul Brophy.
And me, Roisin McClerick. So, Paul, we have a very interesting guest. We're introducing a new political representative here in Kilkenny, but not new to politics.
No, certainly not. We're delighted to be joined by economist Dr. Tom Healy, who was previously the director of the Nevin Institute, or NERI for short. He's also worked for the ESRI, the Economic Social Research Institution, the Northern Ireland Economic Research Centre, the OECD, and he's also worked as a civil servant in the Department of Education. Tom has a wealth of experience. He has a PhD in the areas of economics and sociology, and he's also an author whose book, An Ireland Worth Working For, was published there a number of years ago, and of course is available in all good bookshops. And Tom himself is putting himself forward as the Aontú candidate for the Castlecomer Local Electoral Area in the 2024 local elections, which are taking place next year. So, Tom, you're very welcome to the Irish Political Roundup. Yeah, Tom, you have a fairly distinguished career. You started out in UCD,
Yes.
studying economics. Now, some people call economics a dismal science. What drove you towards studying economics and sociology, which are very, very much linked to politics as well?
It happened by accident, Paul, because when I went to UCD in 1974, I was looking at all the options, and one of the options was political economy. And I said, I like the word political, so I'm going to go for that course. And what emerged, of course, was that UCD gave an interesting and different course in economics to what was on offer in some other institutions. It emphasized the political, but also the aspect of moral values. Now, I think subsequently that changed and it became just pure economics. But I was attracted to the idea of economics, not just as a science, but actually as a way of changing the world and understanding the connection between economy and people and values and politics.
And you were studying in the late 70s, early 80s. Things were very, very difficult in Ireland at the time. In the 1980s, we had very, very high unemployment. We had interest rates like 15, 16%. There was a lot of immigration. So from an economic point of view, Ireland was in a very, very difficult place. But within a period of, let's say, 10, 15 years, it changed rapidly. Was that down to good policy, or was there an element of luck as well involved?
Well, both actually. I obviously factors like investment in education was a major contributing factor to long-term economic development in Ireland. Inward investment, Ireland joining the European Economic Community as it was. And, there were various factors in the international economy that impacted. I suppose the economic path that Ireland has followed is quite different to many other European countries. And it's quite right what you say, Paul. We were a relatively very poor country. Back in the 70s, we were down there with Greece and Portugal at the bottom of the GDP per capita in the EU. And that's dramatically changed now. We're one of the wealthiest countries, actually. You wouldn't think it from the state of some of our public services, but that's another point. Yeah.
And I suppose also during college, you were active within the Labour Party, and you were one of the founder members of Labour Youth in 1979.
That's right.
I think Frank Lusky could have been leader of the Labour Party at that time.
He was. That's right. Well, Brendan Corish, actually, when I joined in 1973, I actually joined in October 1973. I think that's 50 years ago. And
years ago, yeah.
In fact, my first political engagement was in the referendum in 1972. And I wasn't actually a member of Labour at that point, but people may not be aware that the Labour Party and the Irish Congress of Trade Unions campaigned against Ireland joining the
Yeah.
EEC in 1972. Obviously, things dramatically changed once we joined the EEC. And by the way, I strongly believe that it was the right decision to join the EEC and also to stay in the EU. I took a different view when I was 16 years of age. But anyway, we're all allowed to change our views in the light of experience and events. But yes, I joined the Labour Party. I stayed in the party for 8 years. I gave a lot of my time and effort in the Labour Party. I was very much on the left of the Labour Party at that time. I would have been opposed to coalition with Fine Gael, would have been very much, in fact, on the far left of the party. And I left subsequently in 1981. But look, it was a very intense, a very interesting experience. Labour Youth was set up in 1979, and together with other people, we campaigned. Unemployment was one of the biggest issues those days. Actually, it was a huge problem for young people. Yeah,
absolutely. And I was just going through your CV, and you also spent some time working in the Northern Ireland Economic Research Centre. That must have been a very interesting experience.
It was. Yes, it was interesting to live in Belfast for 2 years and to work there. The centre, the Northern Ireland Economic Research Centre, was associated with Queen's University. It was independent, but it had a link with the university. So that gave me an opportunity to experience life in another jurisdiction and to get very familiar with the data on the Northern Ireland economy and society. It was a difficult time, the late 1980s. Obviously, the Troubles were still going on. And I suppose, to be quite honest, I've always had a deep affinity to the North. And I always make it my purpose to go to the North at least a few times each year. And I'm delighted that when I worked in the North, in the Nevin Economic Research Institute, that was in recent years comparatively, I was part of my brief was to oversee economic research for the trade unions in Northern Ireland. So I developed a very keen interest in all island economics. Yeah.
Yeah, and it makes absolute sense. You have, utilize all the 32 counties on the island, and that will have an economic impact with greater. If you can have greater synergies. I know it's difficult there at the moment with Stormont not in play at the moment, but hopefully that'll get back up and running, and then we can get the North South ministerial bodies going again.
And I hope, Tom, you had a lovely experience up north as a dairy woman.
It was a wonderful place, actually. Yeah. I really loved it, and I think romance brought me back to Dublin in 1990. But yes, Belfast was look, it was a friendlier place in spite of all the difficulties and tensions, and obviously there's a huge societal dysfunction arising from sectarianism, and we're all familiar with that. But I met some lovely people, and it was a great experience overall. Yeah, and not just Belfast, but all of the North, because I had a reason to travel to different areas as part of my research, actually, including Derry.
Including Derry. Didn't you tell me on the phone one day, correct me if I'm wrong, that you canvassed in Derry?
Actually, I did. In 1979, in the UK general election, there was a candidate for I think it was the Derry Labour Party, it was called, if I'm not mistaken, or it could have been, it was, there was also the Northern Ireland Labour Party, but I'm not sure if that was exactly the affiliation of the candidate, Bill Webster. Yeah, I do remember canvassing in the city centre. That would have been May 1979, actually, and meeting up with interesting characters in the Bogside and in the Creggan. And it was, I mean, the 70s, I remember going to Belfast as a student in the mid-70s, and look, you were frisked going into bars in the university area, and it was quite an experience those days. And luckily, I never got never witnessed any particular acts of violence, although I did, you know, I was aware you would hear explosions and shooting in the distance when you're living there. It's inevitable. But no, I never. I think when you're younger, you don't think too much about risks, you know. Yeah.
And everybody always says to me, you know, God, you're from there, you grew up in the troubles. I would say, but it was the safest place to grow up. You only had to worry about the troubles, the bombs and the shootings. You didn't have to worry about criminality.
Yeah.
It was just, I used to walk when I was young in the 80s, you know, going to nightclubs and discos and everything else. I used to walk up from the centre of town to my home in the Glen on my own, and it was safe. You know, there was no criminality. You could leave your key in the front door. No robberies. There was no criminality. And that was something I would say in the north. You only had to worry about the troubles.
I was a child when I went with my parents to Derry in 1969. It was the month of June 1969, and we walked the walls of Derry. And I remember my parents were from Cork, and they lived in Dublin. Obviously, I grew up in Dublin. But I remember my mother saying to me, "Take a look at that now," she said, "the Bogside." She said, "You know, you mightn't see that again," she said, because there was huge tension in the build-up the weeks before August 1969. And I didn't go back on the walls. You couldn't walk on the walls until a few years ago. And I remember walking those walls with a tour group, I think about 5 years ago. And I remember that I mean, thank God for the peace that we have, fragile and incomplete as it is. But I mean, I mean, there's so much to be positive about, I think, compared to, you know, some decades ago, in spite of all the problems that we have north and south. Yeah.
So now we're fast tracking you to Kilkenny. And so you tell us about what brought you to Kilkenny, and why you have now decided to enter the political ring and the political race and opportunity to put your name forward for local elections.
There's a lot of questions there, Roisin. So you're going to have to allow me to answer one question at a time, I think.
Plenty of time, don't worry.
Plenty of time.
Okay, I married a lady from Kilkenny very recently, actually, and
congratulations.
And so what brought me to Kilkenny? Well, yes, it was romance again that brought me to Kilkenny, and that's now my home, and I'm very proud to be a Kilkenny citizen. And you know, it's a wonderful community where I live in Goresbridge, and it's a wonderful county and city. Not forgetting Carlow as well, of course, I have to say that. But
on the edge of Carlow, Kilkenny, and Goresbridge.
That's right. Yes, I'm living pretty much on the border there by the River Barrow, near the River Barrow. But yes, in terms of I suppose what motivated me to get involved in politics. Look, I'll be honest, I had no intention of getting involved in politics. I retired 2 years ago. And I said, I've spent all my life kind of busy with different things and growing family. And one of my greatest achievements is my 3 adult children, more than anything else. And I see them very regularly. They come down here, and I go to Dublin quite regularly to see them. But I think look, let me answer this way. This might seem interesting to viewers. Breed Smith from People Before Profit was the main reason that brought me into politics.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
I'm interested. I'm intrigued.
She brought before the Oireachtas legislation earlier this year to essentially liberalize abortion up to 24 weeks of gestation and decriminalize abortion right up to birth. And we don't need to go into all the details of this. Viewers may not be fully aware of this. This is a radical departure from the existing legislative position on abortion. And I feel very strongly that the most fundamental human right is the right to life. Clearly, this is a very difficult subject for many people. People have had very difficult experiences, and who am I to judge anyone? But I do feel very strongly that this foundational principle underlies all issues of social and economic justice. So what I mean by that is we can talk about housing for all, about healthcare services, about public services, about economic equality. And I'm very strongly in favor of those things and working to improve living conditions for people. But if we don't respect human life from the very beginning to the very end, then I think we have a fundamental problem in society. And therefore, when this came to a head and when it was past second stage in the Dáil in the month of May, I woke up politically and said, look, I've been active in supporting the pro-life movement for some time. Because of my professional career, I wasn't able to be too involved beyond a certain limit. But when this happened over the summer, I had to think very carefully about this. Who is going to speak up about this? Who is going to act? Who is going to do something? And I came to the conclusion that single issue campaigning just simply will not cut the mustard here, if I could put it that way. That we need a broad-based political approach that includes all aspects of human rights, social, economic, political, cultural, within which the importance of the basic human right to life is central and is important. So I came to the conclusion that Aontú was the party for me, and not that Aontú is focused primarily on this particular issue, but it's an important issue among others. So I joined the party. Initially, I had no intention of getting involved in running for elections, but let's say other people convinced me that I had something to contribute, and I said, well, okay, I'll give it a go. And in so doing, I think for me, the importance here is the ethic of public service, of giving back to your community what you have received. And I see politics as a vocation, actually, to serve the community, to serve the common good, to help your neighbours in your immediate community, but also in the wider politic locally and in your county. And, it would be much easier for me to say, look, let younger people do this, let other people do it. I can do lots of interesting things, gardening, reading, photography, languages, all sorts of things that I'm interested in and that I love doing that I didn't have time to do when I was working. And then I feel, no, I think there's a need here for individuals to get involved on these issues and to debate them and to try and work for change in our community.
I have a comment to make, and an awful lot of people would say that anybody who is opposed to abortion or pro-life are far right. But you are not a far right, like define far right now. If you even say anything against the political narrative, you're far right. But you come from, like Paul and myself, you come from a left leaning political background, left, center,
Yeah.
So that's really interesting, that because everybody just makes an assumption that anybody who's pro-life is far right. And that's where the narrative has got very mixed up within Irish society and Irish politics and within Irish media.
Well, we're talking now about terms like right and left and far right and far left, and
very interchangeable at the moment.
Define any of them.
Yeah.
If there, in your opinion, then too, as well, we're getting to, there is, in my opinion, there's no political compass anymore.
Yeah, well, let me kind of very, very quickly explain what I think is going on here. Up to about 1989, the world was divided into basically left-leaning or even socialist or communist political goals on the one hand, and on the other hand, conservative, capitalist, private property. So there was a very clear left-right divide politically in Europe, across the world. Ireland was a little bit different because of the complicated national situation and the Civil War and the aftermath of that, and of course the issues of identity in the north of Ireland. But so these issues were fundamentally based on economic and class interests. So class conflict, the role of the state, the issue of democracy, not just in the political legal sense, but in the sense of workplaces, and the whole concept of worker democracy was huge in the 1960s and 1970s. We never hear about it now. The idea that workers would actually have a say in the running of their enterprises and industry. So all of that world changed quite dramatically with the fall of the wall in 1989, the collapse of communism, the Berlin Wall going. And I'm hugely oversimplifying things now. Just bear with me for a moment. What's happened in the last 30 years is that essentially communism and Marxism, in my view, completely failed and were utterly discredited. Yeah. And as a result, social democracy and left of center politics was in crisis in most European countries in the period after the collapse of communism. The communist parties were wiped out in Western Europe, and the Labour parties, if you like, the social democratic parties, reorientated themselves. And what began to happen, I would say, particularly in the last 2 decades, is that a new concept of struggle emerged around issues such as gender and gender identity, so that instead of the capitalist class oppressing the workers, we now have white privileged males oppressing racially disadvantaged females. And so the whole left-right thing has been completely reinterpreted. And this has happened especially in North America, but is now very obvious here in Ireland. So when people say far right, indeed, it very often means anyone who stands for example, the right to life, or indeed, takes a conservative stance on some other social issues. So it's very, very confusing. And the term, so in the past, for example, the big bogeyman was the communists, the Reds, That's kind of gone now because there's not too many of them left, really. And the socialists are now over 70 mostly, and, kind of a dying breed, you might say. But what's the bogeyman now is kind of the right, and it's often, of course, complicated by the fact here in Ireland is that we have a very adolescent relationship with religion and faith. So there's huge anger against the church, and quite understandably, actually. And all of this is complicating things because church, pro-life, all of that is bundled together in one thing, and that's kind of that's the oppressive reality, and therefore it's impossible to have a debate about pro-life without actually getting into a whole debate about the gender aspect of this. So, for example, people say, you are a man, and you therefore have no right to even express an opinion on this. Unless, of course, it's the right idea, then that's different, But so it becomes extremely divisive. It's anti-intellectual, actually. And one of the things I've argued for in the book that I wrote a few years ago is the need for what I called intellectual promiscuity. Think about this now. The idea that actually we need to open up a discussion about all of these issues where nothing is forbidden as long as it is respectful and as long as people are acting in good faith and trust and trying to uncover the truth, the complex truth behind all of these fronts, all of these labels, if you like. Now, having said all that, however, I do need to be quite clear about this. In my view, there is a problem with the far right in this country. but we need to be very clear what we're talking about and even who we're talking about, and that we're not actually mixing up communities that have genuine grievances over issues to do with integration of migrants on the one hand, and on the other hand, individuals or parties that are trying to foment division and hatred and trying to essentially use other people to promote their political agenda. So we need to be very, very careful about this. And of course, we talk about the far right. We also need to talk about the far left. I mean, if the far left is a reality as well, and it's not without major challenges and difficulties. Yeah.
And Tom, would you say there's one component you may have left out there, is the whole Thatcherism and Margaret Thatcher and her impact as well. And when people talk about the centre, and the centre must hold, when people say define what the centre is, they'll very, very much come back to kind of like what Maggie Thatcher kind of, privatisation. You were involved with the trade movement. She absolutely obliterated the trade union movement in the north of England in particular.
Yeah.
Her impact, when we talk about the whole left-right divide, her impact as well was quite significant when we're talking about this whole right-left.
It was, and
definition that we're at now.
That's right. I think the two big drivers of change in terms of economic policy internationally would have been Reagan and Thatcher in the 1980s, and it ushered in a whole period of privatization, curbing of trade union freedoms. It also ushered in a change in the mindset. And I give an example of this because this is very concrete now for people in Kilkenny, in North Kilkenny, actually, because in the 1950s, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, in this country, we built more social housing than private housing. So local authorities built more houses than were built by the private sector in the 1950s. And, but by the time we got to the 1980s, there was a large stock of social housing, council housing. Many people had wonderful experiences growing up in what were called council estates. They weren't sink estates. They were strongly knit communities where people looked out for each other. It wasn't idyllic by any means, and life was difficult, and I'm not suggesting otherwise for a moment. But what began to happen in this country from the 1980s onwards, and this is an important point in terms of local government here in Kilkenny, actually, is that local government, I believe, in this country has been hollowed out. The health boards, first of all, went, so the local authorities had less and less input into healthcare services. Local authorities got rid of direct building and got out of social housing to a large extent, to such an extent that social house building almost vanished, especially during the years of the economic collapse from 2009 onwards. And then at the same time, council houses were sold to people. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in principle. They were sold very often at very good prices from the point of view of the purchaser. And I suppose the assumption that a lot of people made was, if we cut taxes, if we privatize, if we give people more choice and enable everyone to be a homeowner, and, Thatcher was saying all this stuff in the 1980s, and this kind of thinking permeated Ireland in, very much in the 1990s. We had the rise of the PDs, the Progressive Democrats, as they were called. They vanished because their agenda was delivered by governments, especially by the Fianna Fáil PD government from 1997 onwards. So all of this has brought us to a situation where now we have a huge crisis in terms of home ownership, which is due in part, I believe, to the negative impacts of Thatcherism, of neoliberalism, and the impact that it has had on people. And I think the left of centre in Europe, including Ireland, has been extremely weak. And, parties on the centre left have almost abandoned the space that they traditionally occupied in defending workers' interests and have embraced all sorts of other cultural struggles, some of which have validity, some of which are complete distractions from the bread and butter issues. And we have a situation where we have very considerable economic inequality, a huge problem now with a younger generation that is locked out of home ownership effectively, and a situation as well of enormous crisis in our health service, lack of access to primary health care, long hospital waiting lists and diagnostics waiting times that are completely unacceptable. All of this, I believe, is coming back to the problem created by tax cutting and by politicians promising more public expenditure, lower taxes, and fiscal stability. An impossible triangle, actually, to complete. And the crisis.
Have your cake and eat it.
Yeah.
And you made a very interesting point about the working class. You know, Labour was traditionally a working class political party. Working people voted Labour. There is no political party. Paul and I were both in Labour. You were in Labour. Paul and I both left the Labour Party. That's where Paul and I met. We were, Paul taught me how to tally at the counts. You know, we canvassed together. But even, you know, and Labour has gone very middle class, looking for the middle class votes. They are not representing, there is no political party. I wouldn't even say Sinn Féin is really representing the working class party. So and from your political perspective and experience and your economic background, in your view, where do the working class people go now? Is it that where you're representing Aontú? Do you think Aontú is representing the working class people?
I do, and one of the things that I'd like to bring very much to the Aontú policy table is worker rights and our our natural affinity with the trade union movement in terms of defending workers' rights, defending public service, advancing equality. Now, obviously, we're still a very small party, a growing party, north and south. And to answer your question, Roisin, I think it has to be acknowledged that by and large now here in the south of Ireland, the Sinn Féin party has replaced Labour and Labour anyway, and Social Democrats are quite small in terms of the youth vote, but also in terms of working class areas in the bigger cities and towns. It's clear now, at least for the moment anyway, who knows what the future will bring, Sinn Féin has now moved into that space and has embraced some elements of a kind of social democratic left of centre philosophy, not entirely, but there is certainly that reality. Now you could take the view that that's an ancillary aspect to the overall aim that Sinn Féin has of uniting Ireland and ultimately Irish unity. But they've been, I will say this, they've been very good at campaigning on bread and butter issues for 30 years. And they started at about 2% of the polls in the late 1980s, early 90s. They sent people into each constituency and area, worked very hard on issues, and built up year by year a much stronger position. In fact, they started doing what Fianna Fáil used to do decades ago, and they became what they are today, actually, the biggest single political party. Now, who knows what will happen in the next general election, but I think we have to recognize these facts. And, the experience as well of Labour going into government in 2011 and what happened between then and 2016, it really did hugely undermine the Labour Party, and it's difficult to see Labour coming back anytime soon.
So would you say Aontú is a political party for the working class to vote for?
Yes, definitely. And It's a party that reaches out to all sections of the community. We're not essentially representing one particular economic group against another. I suppose historically Labour was the workers, and it was, you know, very much a type of class divide. That is not our role or position. But certainly in terms of many of the issues I've spoken about, public services, equality, workers' rights, I believe Aontú is the party that can deliver on those things, yes.
And you also come from an economic background. So you have you come from a left background, and you also come from an economic background. So you have a very, very good understanding of what the left, the working class, which normally would be considered as left, would be the working class, as you said. And really, that's the people really that are not being listened to now. They've no voice. So yes. You're saying that Aontú is a political party that are going to give the listening ear.
Yes.
And that you hear what the working class people are saying, and a party for which the old Labour, which North Kilkenny, where you're representing, is a very strong Labour Party stronghold.
In some places, yes, definitely. Castlecomer being obviously one of the areas, and there are other locations in Kilkenny. Interesting aspect I find about the political makeup of Kilkenny is that North County Kilkenny, which is the local electoral area which I'm contesting, traditionally has been a very strong Fianna Fáil place with, as you said, Labour pockets here and there. But it's also quite a rural area with towns, you know, such as Castlecomer, Ballyragget, Urlingford. And then, of course, some of the more traditional economic activities, like, for example, the mines in Castlecomer, that would have underpinned a working class vote and particularly a Labour vote. But I think in terms of listening to ordinary people, to workers, to farmers, to people working in the public service, there are many people working in the health sector, many people working in the army who are living in North Kilkenny. And these are people who have been left behind, who haven't been listened to, who have enormous challenges in terms of cost of living, in terms of public services, access to public services. We're meeting people on the doors during the canvass who are despairing because of the lack of proper services for children with special needs. It's very sad to hear some of the stories and to realize actually that the provision of services for children with autism, for example, is almost non-existent in many cases. It defies belief that what people have to go through to get even the most basic help, and in some cases there is no help. So this is important. I think that in many ways political parties have become detached from the real concerns of people and have become fearful of stepping out of line with the dominant themes and the dominant concerns that very often are other than what ordinary people are talking about.
What
and
are
as
you
regards,
Sorry, Paul, go ahead.
Exactly, you've actually took the words right out of my mouth. So, what are you hearing on the doors in the Castlecomer electoral area? What are kind of like the big issues that are coming up? I imagine it's a mixture of like local and national issues.
It is, but primarily local issues. I mean, we've asked people what their concerns are and how we could help in any way, and what issues to take on board. Certainly housing is top of the list, and in particular in the Castlecomer area and other areas, Clock, which is to the north of Castlecomer, the quality of water is a major issue. Now, very often people don't think too much about water if supply and quality is taken for granted, but water is actually very basic to human health, to development, to building, to business expansion, and this is a real issue for people in Castlecomer, and this reflects the lack of investment in water infrastructure over many decades. Old creaking infrastructure and just also a lack of capacity in light of population growth, particularly in the larger urban areas. So these are some of the issues coming up. People are obviously concerned as well about very immediate issues like road safety, speed, all of these areas where local authorities can do something with the limited resources that they have.
And you must be getting the question when you're knocking at the door and say, "Hi, I'm Tom Healy. I'm running for Aontú in the county elections." We're saying, "Oh, Tom, you're new. We've never heard from you before. Oh, we heard you on the local radio speaking and things like that." So, that must be a very interesting conversation you're having with them.
It is. I mean, people are curious what you can bring to the community. I think really the key to local politics is delivering results for people that makes a difference to their lives. This might sound obvious and almost trite, but the people who succeed at local level are the hard workers who deliver. And people will say, "I know that politician, whoever it is, they've done this, they've done that, they've sorted out a medical card issue, they've looked at a renovation grant for their house, they've fixed issues to do with a pedestrian crossing in this particular street." That's the way actually local politics is done. And that's also why I think it's quite difficult for parties to get people to actually come forward and contest. I'm interested to see the extent to which people are rushing to contest the European Parliament elections. And at local level, I've gone into I've attended as an observer the meetings of the Kilkenny County Council recently, very interesting experience actually. And I'm struck by the age profile, by the gender profile, and also by the political profile in the council chambers. And that's not in any way to suggest I'm not saying that people haven't something to contribute. I mean, these are very hardworking people who have delivered a lot for their communities. They're obviously in different parties, and I don't always agree with what they say and do, but I do admire their hard work and commitment. And I think, however, it's quite alarming, I think, that so many people who are, let's say, in mid-career, shall I put it that way, middle of their political careers, are not going forward in the next general election. And in the local elections, many of the candidates, many of the very well-known names here in Kilkenny, are not that young, actually. Now, there's nothing wrong with people contributing politically at any stage of the life cycle, but I think we do need more young people as well. And I think it may be that something is going on there in terms of the perception of the role of a local politician, the workload, but also the negativity, the hostility that people encounter on social media, and people expect someone to fix their problems. And also some people, a minority, are so angry with the political establishment that anyone who comes to the door canvassing is seen as the enemy almost, and that's quite sad actually, because
You're all the same.
Pardon, Paul?
You're all the same. That's probably what's been
exactly
what gets thrown at you.
Yeah.
I'm even saying that now. I'm even asking, what is the difference between the political parties, and what is the difference? So I think that's a very key thing for going forward. Is I can't say that one. Differentiating the difference of why I should vote for you, and from my experience, an awful lot of people are not voting on political parties anymore, but on the personal vote.
True.
And apart from the age, I'm wondering, is that why Ireland is in such a mess? Because over the years, it was about 10 years ago, and it was all about, oh, let's bring in young people. We need young people in politics. Young people were pushed in the Dáil, and now look at the mess of Ireland. Do we need, do we need politicians with wisdom, life experience, and knowledge to steer us through the storm that we are in nationally and locally?
We do, because I think, you know, we've never been so much inundated with information and knowledge. But, you know, there's a saying, you know, where is the wisdom lost in knowledge? You know, where is the knowledge lost in information? And wisdom is difficult to define, but I think, you know, how we all learn in life is through mistakes.
Yeah.
And this applies also at the level of government and economic policy. In this country, we've made enormous mistakes, I believe, economically, fiscally, over the decades. And we paid a huge price for that, you know, about 12 years ago at the onset of the economic crisis. So I think we need people who are wise. That doesn't preclude people who are much younger, who can see sometimes much more clearly the truth, and who can follow their conscience. But I think there is a huge lack of courage and wisdom. And I must say, this is one of the things that also attracted me to Aontú, that the leader of the party, the founder of the party, Peadar Tóibín, here was someone who had a career in front of him, and probably a ministerial portfolio. Who knows, because he was in the Sinn Féin front bench. How I got to meet him actually was when he had the brief on economic development and job creation, and in my role as the director of the Nevin Economic Research Institute, we spoke to all the political parties actually, well, most of them, not all of them, and in relation to economic issues. So that's how I first met him. But here is someone who walked the plank, that lonely, solitary place of conscience, and he had to leave Sinn Féin, and then he decided to set up a new political party. We don't see a lot of that happening. In fact, we don't see that happening at all, actually, in politics. And I think there is a space for wisdom, for courage, for people who will stand up, and far too often the party whip, the prevailing thought, the prevailing message, is drowning out any deviance from this other narrative. And that applies also, by the way, in the realm of economics, because economics has become a very closed intellectual discipline that is not open to other insights from sociology, from psychology, from philosophy. And economics was divorced from a much wider holistic approach to human society and human life. And politics, I think, is the same, that we need to bring many different perspectives in, and we need to value the wisdom of the elders, if I could put it that way.
I think, and we need to, I think ageism has really crept in now. We need to actually go back to respecting the elders within our community. You know, I think that is something within our culture we valued as an Irish culture. We really valued and looked after our older people, and we didn't have ageism. But over the last, say, 20 years, I see ageism slipping in. And, you know, do we as a culture respect the older people within our communities? And locally, what are you hearing from the older people within your constituency at the doors?
Well, very often people are, I suppose, the older community is more concerned about health. That's a big issue, and just access to services in a timely way. And the other interesting insight, which again I think has been overlooked very often, is the problem of isolation and loneliness. It's interesting. I've observed in many cases that older people are afraid to come to the door. I've had a few incidents where people are opening windows and talking from behind the window, so to speak. And for various reasons, I think people have become disconnected very often from their local community. COVID obviously didn't help at all. It left a huge mark. And in some cases, people have not returned to many of the normal activities that they used to to have, like going to bingo, going to the Pioneers, going to mass. But people got used to a certain way of living, and I think that has been negative. I think social isolation is probably a huge determinant of physical health. People don't understand enough the link between social interaction and physical health. And the best thing you can do, in addition to a healthy diet and exercise, is to get out and connect with people. And we're not doing enough of that in our communities.
Do you see, is this what you're hearing and through your experience, are we losing as a nation, and especially you represent a really large part of a rural community within your constituency, is there a breakdown and a disconnect within our communities?
Yes, there certainly is. It manifests itself in many ways, and particularly, I think, in regards to young people, particularly young men, issues of mental health. But it's by no means confined to young people either. And it does raise, for me, a big question about what is missing. And many years ago, a famous person in sociology wrote a book, Bowling Alone. It was about how American civil society had declined, and the term used was the decline of social capital. People were less inclined to volunteer, to get involved in their communities, and this was published about 20 years ago. I think that problem has now very much come to Ireland, and it's much more difficult to get things done in the community. In many rural communities, there were the faithful of maybe a dozen, 2 dozen people who did everything, yeah? And now they're older and they've got health problems, and they just don't have the energy in some cases, to continue on. But the problem is that there's no younger people coming along to replace them. And this is actually quite noticeable, particularly in villages and towns where, let's say, the age profile has changed, has got much older. There is definitely a lack of social engagement. And what are the agents of social engagement? I think a huge positive is the role of sport, obviously, in the GEA. That's a huge factor in supporting community spirit and involvement, and also bringing families in together. But another huge pillar of social engagement traditionally in this country was the church. And church attendance and church engagement has all but disappeared in many areas now, except for the older generation. And even there, it's quite fragile. And one could say, that's hardly surprising, and perhaps people feel more free to pursue their own spirituality or meaning in life. But I think there's a missing gap that hasn't been filled there. And it's quite noticeable, I think, yeah.
And that is because the church used to be, I know I've lapsed from the Catholic Church, and that was all down to the child sexual abuse and the paedophilia within the church. But I have strong faith. I don't go to mass every day, or when I was younger, I used to go every day. And the church used to be the place where the community met. It used to be a real community place.
Yeah.
And that seems to be gone. And there's a big disconnect between the church and the people as well. Religion.
Yeah.
In my opinion, religion has become a dirty word. Even to say that you pray has become a dirty word.
Yes.
Or that you believe in God has become a dirty word. And so what's your opinions on that?
Well, Aontú is a secular party. It's open to all faiths and none. And we don't define our position on the basis of any religious persuasion. However, as individuals, and speaking for myself here, faith is and has been a very important determinant of my politics. And I think we need to be careful here. Politics and faith are separate domains, obviously.
Yeah.
But
definitely.
the motivation to become involved in a struggle for social justice, to change things for the better, I think is motivated. It can be motivated by a faith. So, for example, the gospel reading from 2 Sundays ago was about, you know, what will people have to answer for at the end of their lives, you know? And it included, like, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. That's a tough actual principle, because you know, when the war broke out in the Ukraine 2 years ago, at the time I was living in Dublin, and I struggled a bit, kind of, what can I do to help people fleeing from the war? And I offered to accommodate anyone who was in need. As it turned out, it wasn't possible for various reasons, and that was that. But I think if we take religion seriously, whether it's Christian or any other faith, it makes tough demands on people. And very often people have missed the point that they think religion is all about controlling people's sexuality or telling people what to do with their bodies or whatever. But actually, it's a call to sacrifice yourself for others. And, you know, from my perspective, this is a lifelong journey, learning through mistakes and trying to do things better. But I think that journey to, you know, to be there for others and to put yourself at the service of other people is really what, you know, should define politics. And if people are cynical about politics and about the way that people use politics to advance their ego or their financial position or their power over their other people, it's no wonder that there is a lot of cynicism and alienation from politics. And as regards the church and religion, well, it's been, let's put it this way, Roisin, it's been a publicity disaster, hasn't it? Because the way the whole thing was handled and covered up was really absolutely, and particularly involving the most vulnerable children and members of society. And I'm not convinced that the churches have actually really cleaned up their act on all of that, to be honest.
When you think of the mother and baby homes,
that's
that
right.
was really just commercial child trafficking.
That's
and
right.
then
Yeah.
the cruelty and the social bias towards young women in very vulnerable positions, and yet it was the men that did that, you know,
Walked away.
walked away and kept their reputation, but the women and the way that women were treated. So I think, I agree with you.
A huge stain on our history. Obviously, to be fair, you know, some aspects of social services and care for people provided by the religious over the decades was very positive. And, you know, Kilkenny was an interesting case that you know, that Bishop Birch had the foresight to, I'm talking now about the 1970s, that had the foresight to, you know, to emphasize the church's mission in relation to poverty and struggle for social justice. And I think, you know, that there were positives, but it unfortunately right now, I think a lot of people just can't see any good in what was done in the past, and that's too bad. But I think really the church has only got itself to blame for that, you know. And
there's a big, I think, needs to be a big cleanup operation there, and I think it's not about I don't know. To me, it's just really sad. Before I go to Paul, you know, there's a lot of big issues, and maybe you want to say that, but women, you know, especially with the definition of women. I know that Pádraig being an Aontú were, you know, really working and have strong beliefs about women in sport and women's safe places. And for you, about because you were at the Countess event the other week. Does the definition of a woman mean a lot to you?
It does. I think we look. This is a difficult area because I think there's a great mystery about the human condition, and we are male and female. Biologically, the difference is very clear, but the aspect of identity, of gender fluidity, it's very complex, and it's not helped by the fact that where people, in some cases, don't feel safe, for example, in prisons, that this would be a very clear example, because of someone, changing their gender to, for example, to female from male, or vice versa, that creates a lot of difficulties for people. Now, one of the interesting things about this particular debate is that there's no debate, actually. That's one of the interesting things here in public. And if you dare kind of go into this issue and look at the actual situation in sport, in the prisons, in the school curriculum, for example, you are castigated and put into the role of a trans hater or a homophobe or whatever. All of this, it closes down discussion, and creating safe spaces for people to actually look at these issues in a critical light. And I think, you mentioned the role of Aontú in sponsoring a bill in relation to amending the Gender Recognition Act from 2015 to make special provision in the case of prisons, and that was a very obvious point. It doesn't go beyond that, but it's an important point. But yeah, I mean, these issues are coming to the fore all the time. Look, I'll be honest, they're not central on the doors when you're going around to people canvassing. In fact, no one has really raised this issue so far. And I'm not saying that it's a huge issue for particular individuals, but we do need to recognize that families, that individuals have a right as well to their own perspective on this. And I think there is perhaps an intolerance sometimes towards people who take a very traditional view of gender and family and sexuality, and it's kind of it's impossible then to have a respectful dialogue amongst diverse views.
I suppose this really is like a woman is a woman and man is a man. You cannot change sex, and men cannot play in women's sport. Men should not be in women's changing rooms when they're going into changing rooms. And, and especially in sporting changing rooms, where young girls are in the vulnerable at certain times of the month, and you've got boys coming in who decided to transition and demanding to be in girls' changing rooms. But you cannot change sex, and men cannot give birth, they cannot have periods, they cannot go, and at the end of the day, I think we need to for women's rights are human rights, and women's rights is being questioned now. And
I think all of this change has happened so quickly without really much public attention. And the change in pronouns, it's very typical now in official documents, for example. And you kind of suddenly realize, hold on, I mean, have we actually really thought about this through? And have we thought about all the implications here? When gender recognition was still, when it was introduced legally back in 2015, I suppose the attitude was, let live and let be, and let everyone kind of be free to choose their own. But it's gone much further now, I think. And it's got to a point where it's very difficult to have a reasonable discussion about this. And I was frankly very surprised when I went to that public meeting. I was going for information purposes, really, to find out more about it. And there was heavy security on the door going in the Dolmen Hotel in Carlow. And there was a public campaign online. And I thought, I mean, we didn't have that level of intolerance in the 1970s, the 1980s, from what I can remember, actually. You could be quite a lefty, and people kind of regarded you as a bit odd and maybe unusual, but you weren't closed down or cancelled, shall we say. Now, of course, we didn't have social media those days, that's true, but the idea of actually banning a meeting and saying you are not allowed to discuss this or to have a meeting. That
Women
actually,
talking about women's rights is now being protested by people who think that, you know, it's okay for 5% of the population, which is the trans community, and now sort of have so much funding and so much political say that women's rights are being encroached.
Yeah, well, I think that we haven't seen the end of this, and it's obviously it's one issue. It's not a major issue in Aontú's perspective, but we have taken on board the prison aspect, and you know, we're contending on many different fronts, you know, and I mentioned already the aspect of pro-life, an issue that's getting no publicity. Well, that's not true. There is some publicity, but an issue that's getting relatively little publicity is end-of-life care. And the legislation on euthanasia is progressing through the Oireachtas. That's a huge change coming down the line. And what the implications of that are for palliative care, well, I have to say I'm quite concerned. And again, you know, there is some discussion of it in the media. I do think it's biased, actually. I have that sense, you know, that we're not getting a full insight into this complex area. But I just give that as an example because people can be quite focused on some particular issues, and I'm not saying they're important, that they're not important. They are important. But I would have thought that here we are, you know, coming towards the end of a Dáil term, and issues of profound significance for the beginning of life and for the end of life are coming through the Oireachtas and may very well be settled before the next general election. That's a possibility.
You think they're sneaking them in the back door, these bills?
To some extent, yes. There's a lack of engagement with. I mean, there's an Oireachtas, various Oireachtas committees that are looking at this, obviously, and opinions are being invited. But I just think that people are not fully aware of how far this is going. This is of profound significance, you know, and for the way we care for the elderly, for those who are. You know, particularly those who are in palliative care. And it's a very difficult area because we've all experienced, you know, bereavement, and many of us have accompanied people in their final journey. And I just think we need to kind of stand back and just pause and say, hold on, you know, there's much more going on here than first meets the eye. And okay, it's not something that's going to get a lot of political traction and discussion on the doorsteps, it's true, but I think that if people have more space and time to consider it, I think we need a more healthy debate on these issues. Yeah,
absolutely. And Tom, another movement that should be fairly familiar with, the trade union movement. How would you surmise, or what would you say the state of the trade union movement is in Ireland now in 2023?
It's under pressure because union membership as a proportion of the total workforce has been falling quite consistently over time, and that's the pattern in most European countries, actually. And it reflects a whole number of things: the change in the structure of industry, and I suppose also patterns of engagement. I mean, it was assumed that young people just joined the union when they went into a workplace years ago. Nowadays, it's almost the exception and it's often seen union membership as an insurance policy, just in case someone comes after you or you get into trouble. But actually, I think unions have a huge potential here role. And I think also it forms an important bonding agent to bring people together in the workplace that can be missing. And one of the issues that I'd like to highlight there will be the importance of integrating migrants in the workplace. We have a very diverse workforce now. Close to 1/5 of the workforce are from outside Ireland. That would be particularly the case in hospitality, in parts of retail, and especially in healthcare services. And I think the trade union movement can play a very progressive role in combating prejudice and racism, in ensuring that people are welcomed and included in the Irish workplace and indeed in Irish society. So as a trade union member, I have to say I was proud to stand in O'Connell Street last Monday, in support of diversity, against all the violence that we saw the previous week and the unfortunate events and the poor families that have been impacted by the tragedies in Parnell Square. But I was really glad that the trade union movement took that leadership last Monday, and I was there with my own union, Forsa. And I think even though I'm not anymore in the paid workforce, I'm retired now, I think that the trade union movement really is a way of continuing to exert change, not just on issues like wages and working conditions, but on broader social issues. Now, there are many aspects of trade union positions on, for example, the issue of the right to life, for example, where I would profoundly disagree with what they said in 2018. But be that as it may, there are many other issues where I would be absolutely full square behind the unions. Yeah,
exactly. And if you take even the most basic things that we would take for granted, like the 5-day working week, holidays, sick leave, paternity leave, maternity leave, study leave, all these different things that we have today that we didn't have maybe 50, 60, 70 years ago. It wouldn't have been possible without a trade union movement. So their impact globally has been profound. But as you mentioned there, union membership has kind of gone down, and in certain industries, they're joining the trade union just as kind of like an insurance policy. How could the trade union movement, encourage more members to join?
Well, it's a very important question. I think delivering change for members, not just in terms of pay, but in terms of staffing conditions. And just to take one example, in the hospitals and in the health system, the position now of healthcare workers is very, very difficult. There's a huge pressure now in terms of staffing, in terms of training of staff, and we need to to ensure that people who are qualified and trained should have an opportunity to work in the health service here. But very often it's just not attractive. It's becoming extremely difficult. The same would apply for the Garda Síochána and the army. We rarely talk about the army in this country, but it's...
I'm glad to hear you talking about the army. My son's in the Defence Force.
Yes, yeah, that's defending us.
And my daughter is a doctor. And I'm glad to hear you talking about the HSC and the healthcare system and economically.
Yeah.
Because neither of them can afford a mortgage or to buy a house.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And that's right. And, they're doing incredibly important jobs. I know everyone has an important job to do and it's essential. But I suppose, look, I had an experience 4 Christmases ago when I ended up in St. Luke's Hospital in Kilkenny and with sepsis, and the doctors there, they were all migrant workers. They saved my life, quite literally, and I'm forever grateful to the staff of St. Luke's. I was there for about a week, and came through, had no complications afterwards, thank God. But I think, the value we put on the caring professions especially, it's so important. And I think in many ways, our ethos has been distorted by over-centralization of decision-making, a disempowering of clinicians and doctors and nurses as well, actually. And also the distortion, as I would see it, of the profit motive, the private healthcare profit motive that has distorted healthcare particularly in the USA, but also here in Ireland. And we have a very imbalanced and unfair healthcare service in terms of public and private, and access to diagnostics and access to consultants. And this issue has never been resolved. We've never got to grips with national healthcare in this country, not since Brown in the 1950s. We never got to grips, and we've patched it up, and we've had loads of vision statements, including Sláinte Care, but there's no political will really to change healthcare.
You mentioned the Defence Forces and the Garda Síochána. Morale within both the Defence Forces and now the Garda Síochána have reached a real low. You know, at least the Garda Síochána had a higher morale than the Defence Forces, but now it's come down and they're balanced. What is Aontú's solution to the morale and really? We used to, as a nation, have real pride in the Defence Forces and the Garda Síochána.
Yes, yeah.
That was a real sense of pride. It's as if, to, something that we're not allowed to be proud to be Irish. Let's park the immigration a bit, right? It seems to be, from what I'm understanding, I'm not wanting to know your perspective, is we live in Kilkenny. We're the very proud Kilkenny GA sports clubs and everything else. But there is when it comes to being proud to be Irish, that seems to be a cardinal sin. Just like the morale within the Defence Forces and the morale within the Garda Síochána, who were always held with such high esteem politically and within our communities. And we need to rebuild that sense of pride again.
We do. Well, we also need to be safe on our streets and in our homes. And, the recent events in Dublin just, gave us an insight into just how difficult it is now for guards, the lack of cover, particularly in Dublin city centre, but also out in areas of County Kilkenny where many of the Garda stations are effectively closed for most of the time. And, the speed of response, the availability of guards, the backup they have in terms of technology, in terms of access to whatever they require to do their job properly. And for sure, Aontú has pointed to the decline in numbers, the extent to which guards are resigning from the force. All of this certainly points to a huge crisis of morale. We don't talk a lot about the army, but we need to.
And we're a military city here in Kilkenny.
That's right.
The oldest military barracks in the country with the 3rd Infantry Battalion.
That's right. And it's, if you go back to the 1970s, obviously the troubles in the north was a huge context here. But if you visited a place like the Curragh, for example, it was a whole village with shops and residential places, and there were marching bands and children were involved. There was a huge pride, as you say, Roisin, in being a member of the Defence Forces. And that, it's sad what has happened in the last few decades, the rundown in capacity to such an extent now that it's very doubtful. Well, let me put it this way. There wasn't any question of the army getting involved last week in Dublin, but suppose
they did drive up to Dublin.
Yes.
And Hugh Harris told them he didn't need them.
Right.
What do you think if Hugh Harris, they drove up straight away, they did what their job was to do. Their job is to protect the Garda Síochána. They were up there.
Yeah.
And Drew Harris sent them away and said they didn't need them. Did Drew Harris, in Aontú's perspective, should he, maybe if he had taken the help from the Defence Forces, maybe it wouldn't have escalated to the extent that it did.
I don't know enough about what happened on the day, but my sense of it is that, first of all, right now the army wouldn't have the capacity to intervene in civil disturbances of that nature. I may be wrong, but that's my.
But they were up there. They were up there.
And the other problem is rules of engagement, and there's been a discussion about that in the last few days in relation to GSOC and what guards can do and can't do. But once the army get involved, you know, and we know something about this from obviously a different context in the north, but it changes.
The north was a British army going in there.
True.
The Defence Forces are respected, and their job and role is to protect the Garda Síochána. The Garda Síochána were up there, and they were just, you know, it was terrible to see how, you know, the Garda Síochána were there. And, you know, Drew Harris sent the Defence Forces away. No Irish person would have done in previous years lift a stone or threw anything or abused a Garda Síochána. That was something that was witnessed in the Bogside in the height of the Troubles. That never happened on the streets of Dublin before. And yet every Defence Force member job, and my son would always say, if he saw a Garda Síochána in trouble, his duty, even if he was off duty and in civilian clothes, is to protect the Garda Síochána.
Well, I mean, what happened last week should never happen again, where individual guards were surrounded and chased down the street. It was absolutely scandalous, and it's just so lucky that no one was killed. Actually, you know, I do think I do think there's a huge responsibility on government and the security services to act very prudently here. I think, you know, the roots of this violence need to be identified and dealt with in a very firm way, but we do need to be very careful as well, because I'm convinced there are political elements that are working to inflame the situation, and that, you know, we as a country don't play into their hands. So I think that I take fully your point, Roisin, that the situation in the north with dramatically different context, and you know, with the arrival of the British Army, in the first instance,
it was like watching the Bogside, and I'm a dairy woman, in the height of the Troubles. You could predict what was going to happen. You know, what was on fire, the Lewis on fire, petrol bomb. There wasn't a petrol bomb; it was a box put in an open door of a Garda Síochána car. You know, it was predictable. Drew Harris is from the north. You know, is he? You know, no one. The morale with the Defence Force and Garda Síochána. We need to invest more. We need to invest in our guards and Síochána. We need to invest in our Defence Forces and our health service.
That's exactly the point. And there is a point here as well, I think needs to be introduced, and it is this, that we see the need for much more investment in children, in health, in education, in the guards, in the army, in all these areas that are important, because
and the Navy.
And the Navy, that's right. And the Air Force.
Be careful, because you know.
With
no ships.
Yeah, we need to mind our own waters and our own airspace, and that absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
But here's the thing, and I asked this question, you know, of all political parties, including my own party. We want all this extra expenditure and investment, okay? We also say that we want structural change and reform in the public service to make it more fit for purpose and giving better value for money. So that's a given. But are we prepared as a society to pay more in taxation to make all of this possible? And then the question is who actually pays tax and how is the burden shared. And that is a debate, again, that we are not having about, okay, we've got a climate crisis, we've got population pressure, we've immigration issues, we've got a whole bunch of issues that are putting huge, pressure on services, on housing, on health and education. And we need to face up to this challenge in terms of the correct balance between taxes and spending. And there aren't any votes in calling for more taxes. Everyone wants...
Are we spending the money wisely, though? Are we putting the taxpayers' money in the right areas? And is it being respected within the areas? Economically, we need to get the economics, the bread and butter issues sorted out. People
I agree,
want bread and butter
and
issues.
I think you've made
health, education.
You've made a very relevant point there, Roisin, that you see, there's no point going to people and saying, look, you need to pay more income tax, you need to pay more, let's say, property tax or commercial rates and get more local services. There's no point saying that to people if they, and they can see, people are not silly, they can see that in many ways, the way the system is operating, for example, the health service, there certainly is a lot of waste and duplication and in some cases over management as well. And some of these problems, many of these problems have been identified by Aontú through parliamentary questions, through querying of the health accounts. So I think there's a job of work to do in reforming the public service. I still think, however, that we need to face up to the question on taxation, because relative to other countries, particularly in Northern Europe, we are actually a low tax country. And a lot of people find this hard to believe. But when you add it all up, VAT, excise duties, income taxes, corporation taxes, capital taxes, and so on, we actually collect less as a proportion of national income than other European countries. Now, the comparison is complicated for reasons I won't go into here and now, but that is certainly the case compared to, say, for example, the Nordic countries and countries like Germany, for example. Now, we get what we...
Cost of living here is much higher than the countries in Europe or anywhere else.
It is, for sure.
And would you say, Tom, as well, if there was a trade-off, if we said, like, yes, we'll pay higher taxes, but in return, we will address the cost of living and we will, try to develop more efficient public services, people might say, well, okay, if you're going to do, if you could guarantee me those two things, I don't mind paying that little bit more in tax because I want to see something back. I think people just feel that, as Roisin said, their money is not spent as well as it could be.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'd like to do if I was elected to Kilkenny County Council is to progress. Each year we get a bill for local property tax, let's say, and businesses get a bill for rates. Could we give people a simple graph that shows where their money goes? In Kilkenny, we spend about 112 million euro a year through the local authority on local services, And could we actually see where our income taxes are going, where our local property tax is going, so that people understand that a huge proportion of what we pay in tax goes on the health services, on social welfare, which also supports people who are sick or retired. That would be a big and growing number of proportion of the welfare budget, and so on. So actually, people would see what they're getting in return. Now, as I said already, we need to do better at delivering services and outcomes for what it is that we spend, and it's very difficult to convince people to buy into a bit more tax if they don't trust that money is going to be properly spent and allocated. So there is a trade-off, and it comes down to trust. And if people look at what's happening or what has not been happening with the Children's Hospital, for example, they're saying, well, a few 100 million have gone into that, and what have we got for it? You know, and nothing actually yet. And likewise, the metro in
World's
Dublin.
most expensive hospital when it opens.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
And the metro, and there's nothing even, not a spade or a sod has been turned in the metro.
Metro, yeah, that's right. That's right.
We're coming up to near the end. We're running with a little bit of time, but I'm finding this fascinating, absolutely fascinating, Tom. So, Tom, you're going forward in the local elections, as we mentioned, and you, like myself, you're a blow-in, and you're married to a Kilkenny woman, and you live in a beautiful rural area in the picturesque area of Kilkenny. So maybe, people are listening, they're getting to know the Tom Healy behind the politics here, and your vast experience, your knowledge, your wisdom, and you've always been involved in politics.
Well, indirectly or directly, yeah.
So indirectly, even. Especially setting up the Labour Youth back in your day, and you have an amazing career in economics too. So locally, what would you say your 3 messages to the local people why they should vote for you and Aontú, for you personally and Aontú?
Yes, I think right now it's summed up in housing, healthcare and water infrastructure. And water is a problem not just in Castlecomer, but in many other areas of the county as well, where new developments and new connections to Irish water cannot be made, and as a result of which housing development is definitely impeded. Planning permissions are preventing new development, and that's really a major problem. Housing is certainly the #1 issue, because we've got about 1,700 people on the waiting list for social housing in County Kilkenny at the moment. We've approximately 78 vacant council properties right now. The turnover time in between rentals is on average about 26 weeks at the moment, which is a little bit better than the national average, but it's a way lot more than the average turnover for private rentals, which is about 3 weeks. So I think the first job is actually investing in homes, in building, in adapting existing buildings, in taking over vacant properties, in looking at all our land holdings and any properties. For example, the HSE has a lot of vacant properties actually that can be turned to use for healthcare, but also maybe for other purposes. And the Office of Public Works needs to, really get to work on some of these issues in the public sector. So there is a lot of work to be done at local level. Sometimes people feel that local government is very confined and totally dependent on, or very dependent on, central government grants, and with very little discretion. We have some discretion, and we should use it, and we should be very clear about the priorities.
Also, I would imagine rebuilding the local communities would be, from
Yes.
listening to you earlier on, rebuilding the local communities and listening to what the people within the communities want and asking, and
yes.
what their needs and wants are, and delivering them.
One of the things I'm trying to do is to work with communities to see what way we can actually empower communities to stand up for themselves. What I mean by that is, okay, we tend to have a culture in Ireland where people work through the local politician or the local TD or the councillor, as the case may be, to get something fixed, right? So you go to whoever to get something sorted out, and it's sometimes referred to as clientelism, where the client is the voter gets a problem solved, and the voter rewards the politician. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The problem is that we are not enabling communities to come together to solve their own problems in conjunction with politicians and in conjunction with local authorities. So every town, every village, I believe, should have a community council or forum. Now, it exists to some extent, the development associations, the rural development associations, for example, Tidy Towns, various organizations do act as channels for community voice and community influence. But I think fundamentally we need to work with communities to give back some say. And there is a network of public participation networks, they're called. You know, it's part of the remit of local authorities. We need to develop that much more, and that includes North Kilkenny.
And what you've been going to the county council as an observer. What has your experience of that been so far?
That's fascinating because, look, first of all, I didn't know quite what to expect, and I must say that you know, having attended maybe 3 or 4 meetings at this stage, people have been very welcoming, curious about who this strange person is in the gallery, in the public area, observing the meetings. And by about the 2nd or 3rd meeting, they said, "You're back." I said, "Yep, I'm back. I'm here to stay, and I'm enjoying this." And I suppose the other interesting thing about it is the layout of the room is interesting. I don't know if many people have ever gone in as a public observer. It's quite interesting to hear what goes on. But the layout is interesting because, let me put it this way, Paul and Roisin, on one side of the room is the pro-treaty parties, and on the other side is the anti-treaty. So Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and right in the middle, there's a few individuals, one Green Party, one Labour Party, and one non-party. And I thought, you know, this is actually quite quaint. This is interesting, actually. The other thing that I found very interesting about it is the officials at the top table from the local authority. They represent various parts of the Kilkenny County Council. They're very engaged, very hardworking, very committed people. And I think it's interesting as well to get to know people, you know, in these situations, to put names on faces and to find out, you know, who does what, because a lot of delivery at local government level comes down, I'm afraid to say, to who you know and what, you know, what networks, what conversations, what influence someone can have. So if a TD like, well, I won't name any TD, you know, phones up, you know, the council, they say, oh, that TD is on the phone about issue X or whoever, you know, things do happen that way, you know. And so I think actually part of the role of an elected official, or indeed a public representative, which I am of Aontú in Carlow Kilkenny, not just North Kilkenny, but Carlow Kilkenny, is to actually, you know, to immerse yourself in that world, if I could say, put it that way, and to link back to individuals and local communities.
Have you met, one question, Paul, before I come back to you, have you met Mary Hilda Kavanagh yet? She is some woman for one woman.
That's right, yes, and she was on your channel there a while ago, that's right. And yes, it's yeah, it is interesting. Yeah.
Any questions, Paul?
Yeah, well, firstly, Tom, like I said, thanks a million for coming on. It's been a really fascinating and in-depth conversation. Like I said to you earlier on, we come in with a kind of a basic outline, we bobbed and weaved, and, you know, which was great, and we covered a huge range of topics, and a lot of topics that, you know, are very important to you, which, you know, it's great to be able to give viewers an opportunity to have those opinions expressed, which is great, because this channel is very much about giving all people from all backgrounds an opportunity to express their beliefs and what they stand for. So, like just said, thanks a million for taking the time to sit down with Roisin and ourselves. We wish you every success in the local elections next year in the Castlecomer Electoral Area.
Thank you, and may I commend you on your work. I think this is really valuable work, and we have the opportunity in a discussion like this to go into some depth over a period of time, and we don't get this in very often in the mainstream situation. So I think this is very, very, very valuable. Thank you.
And Tom, you were worried about filling the hour when we were off it, and we've gone over it. But so another question: have you joined a GAA club yet? Have you an interest in GAA? Kilkenny?
I'm developing an interest here in Kilkenny, but I have to be quite careful because I have a lot of cousins in Cork. So, so this is actually, to borrow a phrase, an ecumenical matter. But yes.
And this is not Tipperary.
No.
Yeah.
Tom Healy, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to Paul and me today.
Thank you.